I have never lost in this courtroom, and I didn't plan to start today, even if the man across from me looked at me like he could see my skin under the suit. The camera lights pricked along the back of my neck, a swarm of glass eyes recording the day's match. The room was all clean lines and old wood, oak benches wearing 100 years of polish, flags that didn't dare ripple, a judge's bench that devoured sound. I straightened my tie, charcoal silk, restrained sheen. The suit was a shade darker, tailored so precisely that it wore me like a verdict. It mattered. Clothes could be armor, and armor, when it fit, could be mistaken for skin. "Counselor?" Judge Harrow said without looking up, the way you'd greet a regular at a diner. "Ready for the people, Your Honor," the prosecutor at the far table announced. Not the prosecutor I expected. He rose with a controlled economy that made the press stop whispering. Tall, broad-shouldered, posture so exact it made the flag look slouched. Military in the way he set his feet. Dark hair cropped close, a scar like a thin white hyphen near his temple. The kind that said once upon a time a bullet missed a happier ending by an inch. When he spoke, his voice landed in the room with zero tremor. "For the record, Aiden Shaw, Chief Prosecutor." The new chief. So the rumors were true. I let my eyes skate over him in the polished way a blade skates over bone. "Defense is ready," I said, and the murmuring benches shifted, a ripple of oak and wool. He looked at me then. Really looked, not the quick read most attorneys do. Suit, shoes, watch, posture, the math of power done in 3 seconds. This gaze lingered a fraction too long, not on my watch or my tie, but someplace warmer, more human, unforgivingly precise. A pause like a hand closing around a fact. And then his nostrils flared, barely. Oh, the air between us thinned. I breathed through the cool citrus and steel veil of my suppressants and imagined a wall, brick by brick. I had built better walls than this room had ever seen. "Mr. Shaw, you may proceed," the judge prompted. He didn't take his eyes off me as he stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "what you'll hear today is simple." His cadence was clean, paragraphs clicking into place. No theatrics, no leaning. A machine built to carry weight uphill. Simple. The word made the reporters' pens twitch. 2 rows behind me. Quinn, young associate, tie too bright, heart too visible, leaned toward my shoulder. "That's him?" he whispered. "The new guy." I kept my gaze on Shaw. Eyes front. Quinn. The state's case unfolded with a military neatness that told me he'd drilled this out loud in a room with nothing but a clock for company. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out motive, opportunity, evidence, each piece slotted to the next with the efficiency of a magazine sliding home. Jurors tracked him like a metronome. "He's good," I allowed. Good was cute. I didn't come here for cute. When it was my turn, I rose slowly enough to make the front row of cameras adjust focus. "Members of the jury," I said, "the prosecution has promised you simplicity. I'm here to promise you accuracy." I walked the rails. I let my finger land on exhibits like a pianist finding. Middle C. The inconsistencies were flesh-warm under my palm. Timestamps. That argued with sunlight. A witness who remembered the wrong brand of cigarette. Chain of custody gaps that yawned like trapdoors. I didn't raise my voice either. I just took his clean narrative and poured water into the cracks until ice formed and split it open with a quiet, satisfying sound. Shaw watched me from his table, unmoving, except for the tiniest tilt of his head when I passed, like he was listening to something else, not my words. "He's scenting you," a reckless thought supplied. This new one, sensitive nose, sharpened by desert wind and bad nights. He's sniffing out the fault line under your cement. I don't have a fault line. I have a plan. I finished with a sweet, reasonable smile that made 2 jurors straighten as if they'd been caught texting in church. "Accuracy," I repeated gently, and sat. Quinn exhaled so loudly that the bailiff glanced over. We sparred through the morning, point and counterpoint, 2 thoroughbreds refusing to break into a gallop because it would be undignified to make a scene. But the scene made itself. Reporters' cameras clicked whenever our voices collided. Judge Harrow's sigh acquired an edge. During a recess, I caught Shaw by the water cooler in the shadowed alcove where the corridor bent. Up close his presence was worse, better, than at a distance, like static raised by stormlight. Clean soap, rain against warm concrete, and something steadier underneath that made the animal part of my brain tilt its head. He was already there, paper cup in hand, when I rounded the corner. He froze. Not fear. Calculation that kept his body still while his attention moved. "Mr. Vale," he said, my name in his voice like a verdict read without relish. "I've heard a lot." "Half of it lies," I said pleasantly. "The other half is wishful thinking." His mouth backed away from a smile. "Which half is which?" "Depends on whether you win today." He held my gaze, and there it was again, the almost invisible flare of his nostrils, the way his pupils tightened. Something in his jaw turned to granite. "You wear it well," he said, too quiet for a mic. "The mask." My spine went warm, then cold. "You're confusing me with someone who performs." He shook his head once. "No, I'm saying it's heavy." I stepped past him to the cooler, pressed the lever until the cup brimmed. My hand didn't shake. I was good at not shaking. "Careful, Mr. Shaw. If you start sounding human, people might stop believing you're a machine." His gaze flicked down, not to my tie this time, but to my throat. The pulse there. "Quickly back up." He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "Machines don't smell," he said, barely a breath. The water tasted like dust. I crushed the cup in my palm. The crackle loud between us. "Is there a point to this, or are you just testing your vocabulary?" "The point," he said, eyes still, voice mild, "is that I don't make mistakes with evidence. And I don't make assumptions about people. I verify." A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. How admirable. "Verify away. Already am." And then he stepped back, giving me space I hadn't asked for. Something unclenched where I hadn't noticed it had closed. He walked away first. A small victory. I hate that my bones counted it as anything at all. Back at counsel table, the jousting resumed. He tried to rehabilitate his witness. I threaded the man's own answers. Threw a needle and sewed his credibility into a neat little shroud. Shaw didn't bristle. He adjusted. He learned me in real time, the way someone might disassemble a gun and lay out the parts on a cloth. This new guy sniffs the air like he's hunting, I thought, watching the tendons shift along his wrist as he turned a page. But I am not his Omega. Never. The jury filed out for lunch. Judge Harrow lifted his glasses and finally looked at us, the way a man looks at a sink that has started to leak again. "Counselors," he said dryly, "my docket is not a battlefield. Kindly remember that—" "Of course, Your Honor," Shaw said, unbothered. "Always, Your Honor," I echoed saintly. We were the last to leave. Paperwork, a clerk with too many questions, the press thick at the doors. The corridor smelled like coffee, printer toner, and the ghost of cologne. I cut through the crowd, felt the tug of cameras, the prickle of unasked questions. Outside, the sky was an old bruise over the courthouse steps, and sirens stitched the distance. He caught up with me at the threshold to the marble stairwell, not touching, just there, the heat of his presence an inch from my sleeve. "Vale," he said. "Shaw." We stood like two weather systems negotiating a border. "You're good," he said plainly. "I'm the best." He didn't deny it. "You don't have to carry it alone." I turned. "Is this your opening statement for therapy?" "It's an observation." "Here's mine," I said, stepping into his space, because a step forward is what you do when a wall tries to learn your name. "Do you want to win? Do you want to mark? Choose." The words hung between us, sharp enough to shave with. His pupils widened, then steadied. He didn't reach for me. He didn't retreat, either. The press were 20 feet away, the judge's clerk 10. Anyone could have seen. Anyone could have misunderstood. Something like respect crossed his face and made room for something like trouble. His voice, when it came, had the quiet of a safety being flipped on. "I don't choose without consent," he said. I smiled like I didn't feel my heartbeat in my mouth. "Then I guess you'll have to work for it." "Good," he said. "I prefer a fair fight. This is a courtroom," I reminded him, already turning away. "There's no such thing." The courthouse archive was the kind of place that smelled like neglect. Dust powdered into every seam of the metal cabinets. Fluorescent bulbs flickering overhead like they were paid by the hour, and the faint ghost of paper that had been folded and refolded too many times. I had only come in for a file. I didn't expect company. The secretary, too frazzled, too new, muttered an apology as she closed the heavy door behind us, then the click of the lock. I didn't notice at first. It was Aiden's presence that drew my focus, filling the cramped aisle like he'd been carved for taller rooms. When the knob rattled a minute later and didn't give, her voice filtered faintly through the door. "Sorry. The latch sticks. I'll find the custodian." And then footsteps, fading. Silence pressed in. I exhaled slowly through my teeth. Perfect. Trapped in a filing cabinet with Captain Justice. He didn't move, just leaned against the shelves, hands folded loosely, watching me pace like a caged thing. His calm was an irritant, smooth against the grain of my nerves. "Do you ever fidget?" I demanded. "Or does the army beat that out of you too?" "Standing still is cheaper than pacing holes in the floor," he replied, voice even. I wanted to snarl. Instead, I pivoted on my heel and walked the narrow aisle again. My pulse was hammering against the suppressant patch I wore beneath my collar. It had been fine all morning, steady as clockwork. But here, closed in, the chemical veil began to fray. The air thickened. I could feel it, like humidity before a storm. And he could smell it. Aiden's head tilted just slightly. His nostrils flared once, sharply, before he shut it down with almost military precision. His gaze locked on a point beyond me, disciplined, like he'd trained himself not to track prey. I swore under my breath, tugging at my collar. "Don't you dare." His eyebrows lifted, just a fraction. "Don't I dare what? Sniff around like I'm—" My throat closed around the word. I tried again, sharper, like I'm an animal you're about to hunt. His gaze snapped to mine, steady and, damn it all, calm. "I'm not hunting you." "Sure you're not. That nose of yours says otherwise. You think instincts mean inevitability," he said quietly. "I don't." The suppressant was losing ground. My body ached with the betrayal of it, a heat rising beneath my skin, subtle but unmistakable. I braced both hands against the cold steel cabinet, willing it away, willing him away. "Don't pretend you're better than the rest," I said. "You want it. I can see it. You all want it. The difference is whether you admit it before or after you—" "Stop." The word landed sharp as a gavel, not raised, not harsh, final. I don't touch without consent. Ever. Something cracked in my chest. Anger, yes, but beneath it, something so alien I nearly mistook it for fear. Relief. No one had ever said that to me before. My laugh came out strangled, bitter. "Congratulations. That's a very noble speech. You should print it on business cards. Maybe hand them out after court." He didn't flinch. "It's not a speech. It's a principle." I spun to face him, every muscle taut, daring him to step closer. "You want to test that principle right now?" He didn't. He stayed exactly where he was, shoulders square, distance maintained. The restraint in it stung worse than if he'd closed the gap. My breath came too fast, too shallow. I hated that he could see it, hated more that he wasn't using it. The flickering light buzzed above us, stuttering shadows across his face, catching on the scar at his temple. For one reckless heartbeat, the space between us shrank, not with movement, but with gravity. My pulse dragged me toward him, lips parting before sense could intervene. His gaze met mine, steady, searching, something unspoken trembling in the narrow air. It could have happened then, would have, if not for the scrape of metal and the sudden flood of brighter light. The door groaned open. The secretary's apologetic face appeared in the gap, got it unstuck. "Sorry about that." I stepped back so fast my heel hit the cabinet. Finally." My voice was sharp enough to slice paper. Aiden only nodded, collected, as if he hadn't been standing a breath away from breaking rules written into our bones. We walked out side by side, the fluorescent hallway washing the tension off our shoulders. To anyone else, we looked like rival attorneys leaving the archive with a stack of files. To me, It felt like I'd just survived a war no one else had seen. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I'd won. By midweek, the courthouse started treating us like weather. We moved from courtroom to courtroom, and the pressure changed. Jurors sat up straighter, clerks typed faster, and the gallery filled with a species of spectator that had learned to hold its breath without fainting. Between doors, a reporter murmured, "Gladiators in suits," and for once, I didn't hate the metaphor. If the arena fit, wear it. In Department 14, Aiden set a trap with chain of custody logs. I walked the jury through the evidence room like a docent at a museum of incompetence and made his neat little chain jangle. We both pretended not to hear the cameras clicking when our voices overlapped. In Department 22, I cross-examined a witness who had perfected the art of recalling the wrong details, crisp brand names, shaky timelines. Aiden rehabilitated him enough to get the man back to confused, not malicious. It was almost surgical, the way he sutured credibility with short, unshowy questions. I made a note, not on paper, to never underestimate his economy. By the time we landed in Harrow's courtroom again, the judge had acquired a new mannerism. He took his glasses off, cleaned them, put them back on, and regarded us with the exhausted patience of a man who had seen both the invention and the decline of language. "Counselors," he said, after a particularly spirited exchange ended with two simultaneous objections. "Have either of you considered settling your differences in a venue better suited to kinetic expression? A beat? A boxing ring, perhaps?" The gallery laughed. Aiden didn't. He just inclined his head like the suggestion had merit. I smiled the way a cat smiles at a closed canary cage. "With respect, Your Honor," I said, "we'd hate to deprive the court of our jurisprudential charm. My docket would survive," he muttered, but his mouth twitched. Outside, the press hammered questions against the marble like rain. PR called it narrative. I called it noise. Still, even I couldn't ignore the headlines scrolling across phones at counsel table during lulls. The city's new duel. Shaw versus Vale. Someone posted a photo of us passing each other in a hallway, our shoulders a whisper apart. The caption, "When tectonic plates meet." Quinn reported, with the kind of glee usually reserved for holidays, that odds were circulating in the attorney's lounge. "You're favored for cross," he said, handing me a coffee like tribute to a temperamental deity. "But the money's even on closing arguments." "Tell whoever is collecting bets," I said, "that hedging is for cowards and pension funds." In the press room between sessions, a microphone materialized near my mouth. "Mr. Vale, is it personal?" "It's professional," I said smoothly, "which is a more dangerous species of personal." "And Mr. Shaw?" I looked down the corridor where he was listening to a victim give a statement. Shoulders open, head slightly bowed, so he could hear without looming. "A very worthy opponent," I said, and tried not to examine why the word opponent felt like a lie wrapped around a truth I didn't have language for yet. The afternoon trial ended with a judicial scolding about decorum that somehow felt like a compliment. By early evening, hunger and adrenaline were sharing custody of my mood, which is how I ended up in the courthouse. Cafe, linoleum floors, fluorescent hum, and coffee that tasted like something a machine confesses under duress. A secretary at the next table leaned toward a bailiff, voice low and conspiratorial. "I'm putting 20 on Vale for the 9 a.m. Motion to suppress. Good odds," the bailiff replied. "But Shaw's gotta tell. When he's about to land something, his left hand flattens the page like he's pinning it down." "That's not a tell, that's foreplay," the clerk added, deadpan. The table snorted. I didn't turn because I am a professional, but I did allow myself a comment pitched just loudly enough to carry. "If you're betting on the motion," I said, stirring sugar into an already ruined drink, "save your money. It won't be decided by tells, foreplay, or caffeine. It'll be decided because the warrant is a sieve and Mr. Shaw prefers his evidence without holes." 3 heads snapped toward me. The secretary's eyes went huge. She clapped a hand over her mouth. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Vale. We didn't—" "Please," I said, holding up a palm. "Bet responsibly." They laughed, relief buzzing. It should have been nothing. It felt like normal. but normal had begun to tilt in rooms where he was. Vale. His voice found me before he did. I didn't have to turn to know he was there. Every part of me recognized the particular gravity he brought into a space. He stopped an arm's length away, because he always did. Like there was an invisible line he refused to cross without invitation or emergency. Shaw. I sipped the coffee and grimaced. Have you considered prosecuting this brew? He glanced at my cup. I try not to litigate lost causes. An admission of limits? Be still my heart. He took the seat across from me without asking. It should have annoyed me. It nearly didn't. Up close, the long day had written itself along his jaw in faint tension. He didn't look tired so much as used, like a tool you trust because it bears evidence of work. You're stronger than you want to look, he said without preamble. I raised a brow. And you're more poetic than you want to sound. I mean it. He set his hands on the table, palms down, in a posture that should have read as dominance and somehow landed as steadiness. You don't posture when you don't need to. You cut. But you're hiding something. There it was, the thread I refused to let him pull. I smiled, the sharp one. I'm hiding only my contempt for your confidence. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not quite not. Contempt is easier to carry than fear. Is this another principle? Should I fetch a stenographer? It's an observation. He studied my face the way he studied witnesses, looking for the seam where truth met story. You've built a life like a fortress. I recognize the architecture. Because you've stormed a few? Because I've lived in one. The secretary at the next table had discovered a sudden fascination with her keyboard. The bailiff coughed, uncoughed, and fled. We were briefly alone in a very public room. A laugh escaped me, thin and mean. Tell me, Shaw, do you collect projects? Stray cats? Broken clocks? Equal protection, he said dryly. I don't fix things that don't want fixing. And what do you think I want? I asked, because I was reckless with fatigue, and the way his voice did something to the part of me that still believed in rules. To win, he said. To be left alone. To be seen, but only on your terms. He paused. Also, to pretend bad coffee is a personality. I snorted despite myself. Careful. If you keep being funny, someone will accuse you of charm. He tipped his head, conceding the hit. And then he leaned back a fraction, as if physically reminding himself to give space to the thing between us. That was not a case and not an accident. About the motion tomorrow, he said, tone returning to the terrain we both knew how to walk. The warrant application. Detective Lyle's affidavit is thin on the nexus to the residence. If you aim at the time gap between surveillance and the entry, you think I need coaching? I asked, but not with teeth. I think you like the truth as much as I do. We looked at each other like we were testing the tensile strength of a cable we'd both started to rely on without admitting it existed. Somewhere, a coffee maker sighed in defeat. I'll see you at 9, I said finally. At 9, he echoed, rising. He touched the back of his chair with 2 fingers, one of those small, grounding gestures people pick up when they've had to make peace with leaving things behind. And then he was gone, a moving piece of weather crossing the lobby toward the elevators. Quinn slid into the seat he'd vacated, eyes huge. Is this flirting? It's reconnaissance, I said. With banter, strategic noise. I stood, gathering my case file, my armor, my unreliable coffee. Place your bets, Quinn. But not against me. He grinned. Never. That night, I lay awake with the city's sirens combing through the dark and the echo of a judge's dry joke orbiting an admission I refused to make. Maybe a ring would have been simpler. Rules, rounds, a bell that told you when to stop. Except in our ring there was no bell. Only a press of air in a locked archive, a line he wouldn't cross, and the knowledge that every time we met, in court and left without blood, the crowd called it restraint, when it felt like hunger wearing a suit. I told myself I liked it that way. I told myself I was winning. Both things were almost true. My apartment had all the warmth of a waiting room, which was exactly how I liked it. Minimal furniture, clean lines, cool tones that refused to pick up sunlight no matter the hour. Glass, steel, slate. No family pictures on the walls, no clutter to betray me. The first thing I did when I got home was strip off the suit. Jacket, vest, tie, all folded into perfect lines, as if order could bleach away the chaos under my skin. I was left in a gray undershirt, bare arms carrying the day's adrenaline like residue. Only then did I walk to the shelf above the desk, where one frame interrupted the austerity. The photo was faded, edges curling. My mother's face, too young, too soft. Her smile had been bright, but even in the captured moment, I could see the shadows beneath it. The mark at her throat was blurred by the camera, but I knew it was there. A scar branded by a courtroom, not by choice. I closed my eyes and the memory unspooled, raw as it had been the first time. The courtroom had smelled of wood polish and sweat. I was 10, sitting on a hard bench, my feet not touching the floor. My mother sat at the defense table. She was beautiful, radiant in a way that made people underestimate her, the kind of softness that predators mistake for surrender. The prosecutor was an alpha, sharp suit and sharper grin. He circled her testimony like a shark circling blood. My mother held her head high, answered steadily, until he leaned too close, voice low, words nothing but a challenge masked as law. And then the scent changed. I didn't understand it then, not fully, only that the room tilted and the alpha pressed forward, and my mother, my strong, laughing, stubborn mother, was dragged under the tide of instincts she hadn't consented to, marked, right there, in front of the jury, the judge, the world. The gavel had fallen like a mockery. The law hadn't stopped him. The law had made it possible. I'd sat frozen, a boy watching the definition of powerless carve itself into his bones. That was the day I swore never again. Never for me, never for anyone else I could reach. I'd put on suits sharp enough to cut, words honed like knives, and I'd break the system from the inside. If the world believed Omegas were toys, then I'd be the one to rip the game apart. The present came back with the sound of my breath against the glass of the frame. I set it down too carefully, as if care could erase the rage that had lived with me since childhood. The knock at my door was soft, but insistent. When I opened it, Aiden Shaw stood in the hall, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a manila folder. His expression was unreadable, though I'd already learned that unreadable didn't mean unfeeling. "Evening," he said. "I didn't come to intrude. You failed already," I muttered, stepping back anyway. He entered like he'd been trained to assess spaces. One glance, one inhale, the quiet acknowledgement of another person's walls. He placed the folder on my counter. "Old case files. I thought you might want to see them before tomorrow." I didn't touch them. "Which files?" "Vale versus State. 20 years ago. Your mother's case." My chest went tight. "You've been digging." "It wasn't hard," he said simply. "Your name is on the record." "And hers. You think this earns you points, sympathy, a free pass?" His gaze was steady, nothing smug, nothing pitying, just steady. "I think it explains things. Don't." The words snapped out of me before I could leash it. I turned away, pacing the cold floor. Every nerve in me lit like a fuse. "Don't you dare stand here and dissect me like some cautionary tale. Don't pretend you understand. And don't ever pity me." "I don't," he said, calm as stone. I spun on him. "You're lying." "No." His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "I don't pity survivors." The word hit me harder than I expected. I faltered, then forced steel back into my spine. "Survivors. That's your term of choice? You really think that makes it better?" "It makes it true." He took one small step closer, careful, like he was approaching not me, but the fracture in my armor. "You live, despite everything. That's not something to pity. That's something to respect." My throat tightened, traitorous. I laughed instead. Sharp, bitter, respect. That's what you call it? Watching someone claw out of the pit you shoved them into and applauding from the rim? "I didn't shove you," he said quietly. "And I'm not on the rim. I'm here." Silence settled heavy between us. The flicker of the lamp painted shadows against the walls, long and fragile. I wanted to tell him to leave, to slam the door on his steady voice and his too patient eyes. But the words tangled with the image of my mother in that courtroom and the boy I had been. Fists clenched, powerless. Something cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. Respect won't change anything, I whispered. Maybe not, Aiden said. But it's a start. He left the file behind. I didn't open it, not that night. Instead, I sat alone in my cold apartment, staring at the photo, feeling the first tremor in the walls I'd spent my whole life building. And I hated him for it. Almost as much as I wanted to believe him. The universe has a sick sense of humor. Judge Harrow announced it at the morning docket review with the same tone one might use to order dental work. Given the overlap in counsel experience, I am assigning Chief Prosecutor Shaw and Defense Counsel Vale to work jointly on the matter of State versus Dorian et al., the trafficking ring investigation. You'll share evidence, coordinate witnesses, and ensure this trial does not collapse under its own weight. The room went quiet, except for the sound of my molars grinding. Aiden's only response was a polite, "Understood, Your Honor." I wanted to object on grounds of sanity. Instead, I folded my arms. If this ends in homicide, it won't be me you'll need to indict. The judge peered at me over his glasses. If either of you survives the other, I'll be shocked. Our first strategy session was in the prosecutor's office. Sterile wood, state seal staring down like a disapproving ancestor. Stacks of files littered the desk. We build the case, top down, Aiden said, tapping the indictment. Start with financials. Nail the organizers. Then work down to the recruiters. Wrong, I snapped. Start with the recruiters. Flip the weak links, squeeze them, and watch the big ones panic. The top will fold themselves if the floor crumbles. His eyes narrowed, calm but unyielding. That's riskier. They'll shred evidence the moment they smell blood. And they'll shred you if you play too noble, I shot back. The silence stretched until Quinn, wisely, excused himself with a muttered, "Coffee run." We stood toe-to-toe across the desk, not yelling, but close enough that the air vibrated with the effort of restraint. Finally, Aiden said, "Fine. We'll split the approach, top down and bottom up." I scoffed. "Congratulations. You've just invented sideways." The corner of his mouth almost twitched. The case metastasized into every surface. Photographs of victims, ledgers, transcripts, half-legible emails. We occupied the same office for hours, days, nights. Coffee cups multiplied. Paper towers leaned. At 3 a.m, I rubbed my temples and muttered, "This is a war crime." "Working late?" Aiden asked, highlighting a passage with calm precision. "No," I said. "This is dying in slow motion while fluorescent lights mock us." "You're dramatic," he said mildly. "I'm awake." "There's a difference." He didn't argue. He slid a fresh cup of coffee toward me. "Here. Poisoned, obviously." I took it, sniffed. Not enough arsenic. "Amateur." We fell into that rhythm. Sarcasm and counterpoint. The seesaw of irritation and humor that somehow kept the exhaustion at bay. I hated to admit it, but he made the hours survivable. On the 5th night, when the last witness interview ran long and the janitors had already vacuumed the halls twice, Aiden shut the file and said, "Come on. I'm not moving until this affidavit stops contradicting itself. Then you'll die at the desk." He gathered his coat. "Dinner. Now." I should have refused. I didn't. The cafe he chose wasn't one of the courthouse haunts, but a small place 2 blocks away. Dim lights, cracked leather booths, the smell of garlic, and something sweet frying in butter. The waitress greeted him like she knew him. "You have a fan club," I said as we slid into a booth. "She just appreciates regular tipping," he said. The food arrived quickly. Pasta, bread, dishes too warm to resent. I realized halfway through that I hadn't eaten anything real in 2 days. Aiden noticed. "You eat like a man rediscovering fire. I nearly choked on bread," says the one inhaling spaghetti like a vacuum cleaner. His lips twitched. Efficient consumption. The words, the tone, the deadpan. It cracked something in me I didn't know was brittle. Laughter broke out of my throat, real, sharp, unpolished. Heads turned from other tables. I covered my mouth, but it was too late. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that. Aiden just watched, eyes steady, something softer behind them. Later, back at my apartment, I stood in the doorway and let the quiet settle. My chest still held the echo of laughter, foreign and dangerous. He isn't like the others, I thought reluctantly. He doesn't push, doesn't pry the way alphas usually do. He waits. He respects lines I thought no one could see, but that didn't mean I was safe. Trust was a currency I had never been able to afford. And just because his presence felt less like a cage and more like something else, didn't mean I could let myself believe. I leaned against the cold wall, the shadows cutting across my suit in sharp lines, and told myself the same lie I'd been telling since childhood. Walls don't crack, not mine. And if one did tonight, under the weight of humor and pasta and the faintest shape of warmth, no one would ever know. The trial opened to a packed house. Cameras clustered like crows along the back rail, pens poised, the gallery full of faces hungry for a spectacle. I felt it settle on my skin, the heat of 100 eyes, and drew my walls tight. I had learned to breathe slowly in rooms like this, to become steel and silk and nothing that bleeds. The charges were ugly: conspiracy, kidnapping, aggravated assault, unlawful restraint. The defendants occupied 2 full rows with their lawyers, a small phalanx in suits. On the far end sat Dorian, the alleged organizer, expression composed into something a jury might mistake for calm. Aiden stood at the state's table, posture straight, his presence the kind of quiet that changes barometric pressure. "People may call their first witness," Judge Harrow said, gavel resting in his palm like a sleeping animal. The morning moved with the inexorable march of a parade. Aiden built the scaffolding, detectives, analysts, the forensic accountant who walked the jury through a lattice of shell companies like it was a children's puzzle. He didn't raise his voice or pound the table. He simply laid stone on stone. And when he turned to the jury to mark a point, his left hand flattened the page as if pinning down the truth. By afternoon, the defense tried to muddy the water. Dorian's counsel, a man who loved his own voice the way some men love mirrors, rose with a smile that telegraphed trap. "Mr. Vale," he said when it was my turn to examine a cooperating recruiter, "before we continue, the defense requests," he veered, not at the witness, at me, to inquire into counsel's credibility. Specifically, the bias that might arise from counsel's biological category. The room changed temperature. It was subtle, like the instant before a storm when the birds go silent. My spine went rigid. The old instinct to draw blood with words flared bright. "Objection." Aiden's voice cut across the aisle with the precision of a scalpel. "Counsel's biology is not evidence." Dorian's attorney spread his hands, faux reasonable. "The jury is entitled to understand whether Mr. Vale, in representing the state's interests today, is—" "I said objection," Aiden repeated, louder. "Relevance. Prejudice. Counsel knows better." "Your Honor," opposing counsel persisted, "if Mr. Vale is an—" "Enough." Aiden's hand came down flat on the motion binder with a sound that snapped the room to attention. "You will not out my colleague in open court to taint this jury. You will not weaponize scent or rumor as substitute for proof. If you have evidence, present it. If you have law, argue it. If all you have is innuendo, sit down." It was the most I had heard him speak without pausing. Not a speech, an indictment. A ripple went through the gallery, indrawn breath, whispered shock. Someone in the back clapped. A single dry sound. Others followed before the judge's gavel cracked like a whip. "Order." Harrow's gaze swept the room, then settled on defense counsel with a weight that would bend steel. "You will confine yourself to facts and law." Mr. Shaw's objection is sustained. Any further attempt to raise counsel's biology will earn sanctions and a mistrial you will not enjoy explaining to your client. Opposing counsel sat down, color modeling his cheeks. Aiden didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The air between us steadied. My own heartbeat slowed from a hammer to a drum. I lifted my file, found my voice, and turned back to the witness. "Mr. Perez," I said, calm like surgery, "let's return to what matters. The text messages you received from Dorian's lieutenant, were they instructions to recruit or to restrain?" "To recruit," he said, eyes on his folded hands, And when recruits resisted, we were told to make them stop resisting. How? His silence was the length of a life. By pairing them with alphas who wouldn't take no. A murmur ran through the benches. I let it crest and fall. Today, I said, "You're testifying because I was wrong," he whispered. "And because I don't want to see it happen again." We built the afternoon together, Aiden pulling wires through affidavits and bank records, me knotting those wires to human hands and harm. It was a choreography we hadn't rehearsed and yet executed like a routine passing, the jury's attention back and forth without stepping on each other's feet. He introduced a photo of a storage unit. I drew out the fact that the units were soundproofed. He called the data analyst. I used her triangulations to place burner phones within a circle of addresses that mapped onto victims' last known locations. By the time the accountant returned to the stand with a supplemental ledger, one Aiden had pried loose at 2 in the morning with a subpoena and a cold cup of coffee. The arc of the ring was visible, ugly and whole. Shell corporations looped into each other like snakes eating their tails. Payments coded as consulting drifted like oil slicks to a central account controlled by a Dorian family trust. "Mr. Shu," Aiden said, voice even, pen still, "walk us through Exhibit 94. His questions were simple, the kind that leave no handholds for a witness to slide off. Who authorized these transfers? Shu adjusted his glasses. Ultimately, Mr. Dorian. And the purpose of these payments? Cash to recruiters and handlers. Bonuses pegged to acquisition. Acquisition of what? Aiden didn't look at the jury. He looked at the witness. Omegas, Shu said, the word thin. Unwilling ones. Silence again. Not empty. Electric. When it was my turn to address the jury, I didn't pace. I stood where I was and let the exhibits breathe. "You've heard the state's narrative," I said. "You've seen its bones. Money in, pain out. People turned into inventory. But law is more than a ledger. It's consent. Without consent, every touch is violence, every collar a crime." I let my eyes rest an instant on Dorian's table. "The defense may want you to believe biology makes behavior inevitable. It doesn't. Choice does. Policy does. Profit does. You saw who chose." The afternoon poured into closing arguments like a river finding its ocean. Aiden spoke last for the state. No thunder, only weather. The slow build that ends in rain. "You don't need to be an omega to recognize coercion," he told them. "You don't need to be an alpha to reject it. You just need to decide whether consent matters in this courtroom. If it does, the verdict is not complicated." The jury retired. The press exhaled. The defendants stared at their hands or at the wall as if new doors might open there if they wished hard enough. I sat, feeling my pulse in my wrists, that old boy in a wooden bench folded tight inside the man I'd built around him. Aiden's chair scraped back. He didn't speak. He reached for the carafe, poured water into 2 paper cups, set one in front of me. The simplest thing. I stared at it, absurdly undone. The jury came back before the reporters could rebuild their scaffolds of prediction. The foreperson rose. The clerk took the paper. The judge's face arranged itself into neutrality. On count 1, guilty. A sound went through the room like wind through winter trees. The clerk read on. Guilty. 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 Each word an iron nail-driven flush. Dorian's jaw tightened. Someone behind him swore softly. I didn't turn. I watched the foreperson's mouth shape the last syllable, and felt something inside me, something knotted and small and mean. Loosen. Judge Harrow thanked the jury, denied bail, set sentencing. The gavel fell. The room erupted. Reporters rose like birds. A victim in the second row began to cry, quietly, into her hands. The deputy reached for Dorian's elbow. I stood on legs that felt less like weapons and more like what they were. Legs. The air tasted like dust and relief. Aiden faced me across the narrow canyon of counsel tables. For a beat, the noise blurred. It was just him. His steady eyes. The echo of his voice from hours earlier cutting off a man who would have turned me into a prop. I didn't thank easily. I didn't thank at all. "Good work," I said. "You too." A hint of something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not triumph. Recognition. We walked out together, and the press swarmed. Microphones thrust like spears. Mr. Shaw, Mr. Vale. Is this the end of the ring? How did you coordinate? Is it true? Aiden lifted a hand. Today, he said, belongs to the survivors. Ask them what matters. The questions faltered, turned. The crowd split to make the space he asked for. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His body made a quiet shelter next to mine while the storm moved past. On the courthouse steps, wind lifted the edge of my coat. For the first time in longer than I could measure, the weight didn't rest solely on my shoulders. The line of fire we'd stood in had not burned me alone. I wasn't naive enough to call it safety, but as we descended into the noise and weather of the city, I let myself name it something close, not alone. The rain was steady by the time we got back to my apartment, a thin silver curtain sliding down the windows. The city outside blurred into streaks of light, headlights turning into ghosts that never reached the glass. Inside, the silence was heavier than the storm. We had won. The verdict still rang in my ears like a struck bell. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word driving the last nail into Dorian's empire. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I stood in my own living room with damp hair and a heart that hadn't decided whether to keep sprinting or stop altogether. Aiden closed the door behind him. He didn't look out of place, even in a space designed to keep people out. He shrugged off his coat, hung it neatly on the rack, and turned back to me with that maddening steadiness. You're quiet, he said. You expected confetti? I dropped my briefcase on the couch. Forgive me if I'm not the party hat type. Noted, he said, moving past me into the kitchen like he'd lived here before. He poured 2 glasses of water, set one on the counter where I could reach it. We circled each other for a while, the silence filled only by rain and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. My nerves were a wire pulled too tight. Finally, I broke it. If you were planning on sealing this in the courthouse, forget it. I just had the carpet cleaned. His head tilted, almost a smile. So, your apartment is officially safer than the courtroom. Marginally, I said. No reporters, no gavel, just bad lighting and mediocre whiskey. Better odds than we've had so far. I should have laughed it off. I should have waved him out with some cutting remark and buried myself in work. But the room was too quiet, and he was still standing there, steady as always, as if waiting for me to choose. And I realized I wanted to, not because instinct pushed me, not because biology demanded it, but because for once in my life, the choice was mine. I crossed the room slowly, the way a man might approach fire, both drawn and wary. He didn't move toward me. He let me close the space. When I stopped, close enough to feel the heat of him, I said, "Don't mistake this for surrender." His voice was low. I wouldn't. My chest tightened, then loosened, like a cage door opening. I reached for him, my fingers brushing his collar, the world narrowing to the feel of skin under fabric. His scent was there, muted by restraint, waiting but not pressing. And when I lifted my chin, his hand came up, but only to cup the side of my face, light, steady, asking without words. Yes, I said. Just that. The kiss was not a claim, not a battle. It was the quietest agreement I'd ever made. Later, the mark itself came with a hush, not a spectacle. No court, no jury, no eyes waiting to watch me falter. Only my living room, the storm outside, the sound of our breathing. It didn't feel like branding. It felt like being seen, wholly and without disguise. I had spent years burying myself under steel and sarcasm, suppressants and strategies. But under his mouth, I was only myself. When it was done, I didn't feel owned. I felt, finally, free. The next day, the papers called it the trial of the decade. Headlines screamed, Shaw and Vale crush Omega trafficking ring. Photos of us side by side on the courthouse steps sprawled across front pages. At the cafe, Quinn slid a copy across the table, grinning. The office pool's ruined. No one bet on both of you winning. Shocking lack of imagination, I muttered, sipping burnt coffee. Across the room, a secretary whispered to a bailiff. So who really won? The bailiff shrugged. Hard to say. They both walked out standing. I didn't correct them. That evening, alone again, I caught myself in the mirror. For years I'd perfected the sharp smile, the one that sliced through witnesses and scared off rivals. What I saw instead was something quieter, softer at the edges. Not victory, not armor, freedom. And it startled me enough to laugh, quietly, at my own reflection. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. And for the first time ever, I let myself believe that was allowed.